Greetings, everyone. I am very excited today to be in conversation with Jose Barrera, who is an amazing software engineer and author of the book Dendera Temple of Time, The Celestial Wisdom of Ancient Egypt. And we're going to talk about his work with photographing the temple and then researching and exploring its deeper meaning. And it's an extraordinary book, Jose, and I highly recommend it to everyone. I originally found out about it through Barbara Hand Clow, well internationally known astrologer and friend of mine who's very connected with Inner Traditions, the publisher. And your book came out 2024 from Inner Traditions. So let me just briefly introduce Jose, and then we'll get into our conversation. He's a software engineer and application architect. He has been fascinated by alchemy and Egyptian culture for more than 20 years. He's an avid photographer, and his work has been exhibited in galleries in Chicago and New York City. He was born in Colombia and holds a master's degree in computer science, and he currently lives in New York City. And I would say you're an interesting Renaissance man, Jose, in terms of the range of your interests and how that then came into play in your writing this book. But I'd love it if you started by talking about how you got into this adventure.
Perfect. And Heather, first of all, let me thank you for having me here and your kind words. And I hope I don't disappoint in this interview. So thank you so much in this chat. So let's start somewhere else, and I'll take you slowly there, but surely there. And is when you say that I'm a Renaissance man, I don't feel that I am. But what I do feel is that in order to understand anything, it has to be in context with everything else. So in order to make sense of something, you have to understand the context of that thing and the surroundings of that thing. And then when you use this method of understanding, what ends up happening is that everything is related to everything else. And the goal of the game, and I see it as a game, is to try to make a holistic vision of everything that is harmonious, that doesn't have contradictions. And that's my game. And it's a hobby for me to try to do that. And it's a passion. And it's every time you find a new piece of the puzzle that you can put and it fits perfectly, then it feels wonderful. It's one of the best feelings you can ever have, is find a piece of knowledge that makes sense and you can put it in context with everything else. So when you say that, I think that's my approach to knowledge and to life in general, is trying to make sense. And in a way, I'm an engineer by trade, so I'm hyper rational. And to me, I need to understand the machinery behind things in order to make sense in my head of them. And it becomes very challenging when you move out of the hard sciences and math and trigonometry and all these things, and you start to move to more things like symbolical things and symbology and astrology and these things, especially in particular in Egypt, that is so foreign from us. Then it becomes more challenging. So the puzzle game becomes more interesting because it's harder, and it gets harder as things get softer and more ambiguous. But my prime and what I truly like, that the thing that is cohesive to all these things is that everything has to make sense. So to me, everything has to be explicable, explainable in a harmonious way and in context with everything else.
If I can say something in response to that, Jose,
Yeah.
part of what's extraordinary from my perspective is just what you said is such a reflection of, I think, your connection to that ancient Egyptian metaphysical understanding that everything is interconnected, that the metaphysical, spiritual reality is interwoven with our physical reality. It's all a part of a holistic, harmonious whole. So you carry that deep ancient wisdom, but you've integrated it with this modern scientific understanding and your engineering mind. It's quite
Correct.
a combination.
Thank you, thank you. And so going back to your original question on how did all this started, so the whole book and the idea of the book and the whole seed of this started one winter, many years ago, probably like 7 or 8 years ago. Uh, I live in New York City, and my daughters at the time were like 12 and 10. Now they are actually it was longer because now they're 21. Now that I think about it, but okay, 9 years ago. But uh, so it wasn't like a cold winter, and we had nothing to do, and we were walking down Fifth Avenue, and there was an exhibition of and the reproduction of the the tomb of King Tutankhamun. And we were walking down and we were like bored and freezing. And it looked like a tourist trap, like obviously in Fifth Avenue. So we went in. I was expecting to be ripped off and disappointed. And when I came into this place, it was an exact replica of all the artifacts that Carter found in the tomb, and they basically a group of Egyptians. What they did was that they made based on the photos that Carter took, they made replicas of all the objects and they reconstructed the rooms that Carter found, and it was magnificent. It was beautiful. Mm, so we went there and I was like mesmerized by the beauty of this. And I've never been in Egypt before that. And that day I decided I have to see a real thing. And then 3 months later, this was like in January, and like in April of that year, we were with my family, my daughters and my wife. We went to Egypt to see the real thing. And along the lines of what we were looking at, we ended up at this temple in a city called actually is Kena, and which is the new town, and that's where Dendera used to be. That used to be a very important site, religious site in ancient Egypt, and it was the center of worship of the goddess Hathor. Although she was worshipped across Egypt everywhere, because she's one of the oldest deities in Egypt, her center, her worship and political center was in Dendera. So that's where the Temple of Dendera is, the Temple of Hathor, Dendera today. And it has one feature that is interesting and it's beautiful, and it's that it's in pristine condition. So, and you were telling me that you just came back from there. I'm so jealous about it. Uh, how was your experience this time? I would love to know that. Like,
Well, as I was telling you before we got on the recording, it
mhm,
was that's one of my favorite temples. It's just exquisite.
mhm,
It its original construction started 2250 BCE. It was completed 350 BCE. But to have read your book and to have integrated your understanding of the ceiling of that entryway and its connection to Hathor and to the cycles of time added so much depth and richness to this experience with this trip. And from my perspective, each time I've gone back to Egypt, the experience that I have is different, and my understanding of the energies of the temples really deepen. And I
mhm,
love that that temple was, its construction started in the age of Taurus. Hathor is associated with the energies of Taurus, but she's also a sky goddess, but is so much about the energy of fertility and love and creativity. And I love that understanding in ancient Egypt that these deities were actually, for them, the Neteru, archetypal principles or energies of the cosmos.
mhm,
So she really carries that energy of creation, of the sky, of the cycles of life, which so fits with some of your research and discovery of the meaning of these paintings in.
mhm. Oh, he's beautiful. There are so many things that I like in retrospect when I think about like when I wrote the book and now, there's so many things that are left out of the book, that like later thoughts, I was like, oh God, I wish I was able to write these on the book, and new insights that I had and so on, thinking retrospective about the book. One of the interesting things, like, so Hathor is a cow, is the cow goddess, and her mark in the sky is the Milky Way. So it's the milk in the sky, like, and the Milky Way, the name comes from there, right? Mm, so is the milk of the goddess Hathor, and that Milky Way was seen as the Nile River of the sky of the netherworld.
Yes.
So it's super interesting because she's the goddess of life. Hathor is life. And that's one of the most attractive things to me about this temple, is that this temple is a temple of life. And you go to many temples in Egypt, and each of them has a different vibration. It's like a different feeling. But many of them are martial temples, where when you
Especially from
go,
the age of Aries. Yes.
yes. So they're martial, right? Now the temple of Dendera, because it's the temple of the cow goddess, it's a temple of life, and you feel so cozy and welcome inside. It's a beautiful feeling.
It's interesting that in the very ancient times in ancient Egypt, they really associated the circumpolar stars, the stars in the sky that never rise and set and disappear, the
Hmm.
stars of the Milky Way, as associated with the energies of the sacred feminine,
Hmm.
associated with the energies of the goddess of creation, who
Hmm.
holds all that is in these cycles of life, death, rebirth that
Right.
we experience here
And
on Earth.
yeah, and actually those are they call them the unperishables, which are the stars that, like, or the eternals, because they're indestructibles, because they never set, right? Like you can see, because they're so north up, that the preset, or the movement, the waggling of the seasons, right? As the sky shifts, because they're so high north, then you can always see them. So every night you can see they never set during the night, basically. So that's why they're called the imperishables. And that's something that is super interesting about all these fundamental forces of nature, the nethers, right? Is that they're dualistic in nature, in the sense that an excess of them can be bad, but a lack of them also. So there are these dualistic forces that both contribute for creation and destruction. Same thing with Set, right? Set is the heat of the sun, and he's the one that makes the deserts barren, and creates like the lack of life on deserts. But at the same time, without the sun, you wouldn't have life. So it's these dual forces and and that's why the main point and the central point of the philosophy in Egypt was the idea of balance, and it's called Ma'at. And it's the idea you can balance these opposite forces in a point where, when they're balanced and stable, then you create the Goldilocks uh, place, which is the Nile in the good years, that is the most fertile place in the world. So, but surrounded by all these extreme forces, right? Of the heat of the desert, and is what you have is an oasis, like the most fertile land in the world, in the middle of the harshest desert in the world. It's a paradox, it's a contradiction, and it's the balance of extreme forces against each other together, or you can see them against each other or complementing each other. Is the other way.
Well, that's brilliantly said, because
Mhm.
they're that energy of Ma'at, that principle of Ma'at,
Mhm.
how do we hold everything in its wholeness and
Mhm.
in harmonious balance. But let's talk more about the temple of Dendera and how these energies really guide us, and how to be in harmony, in right relationship with time and all the cycles of time.
Perfect. So I think the main feature of this temple, the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, is the most impressive thing it has is the ceiling, the pronaos. The pronaos is the room, that the entrance, the hallway of the temple. And these temples, they always have the same architecture, And what you have is at the center of the temple, you have the Holy of Holies. This is also called the Sanctum Sanctorum, and is basically where the figure, the statue of the deity of the temple resides. And that's temples are like a womb, and then at the core of the womb is the body of the deity, right? Like the kernel of life right there, of, of divinity. And then temples were built as an onion around. So the first thing that you build is this shrine that is a small room, very intimate. And then what they start to do is they start to edify around and build more rooms and more things. So the temple, the structure of the temple starts to grow around the Holy of Holies. And then at the entrance, they always had this colonnade with usually 24 columns, one for each hour of the day. And that's the main entrance of the temples. And in the case of the Temple of Hathor, at the ceiling of that room, what they decided to do is depict all these celestial images in 7 panels. And because this is a late temple, this temple was built at the time of Cleopatra. This room in particular. One interesting thing about that is that most of the Egyptian knowledge of astronomical knowledge was encoded on the ceiling. So you have a lot of all the ideas that they had about astronomy are there. But what is interesting about this is that when you look at it, is a celestial ceiling full of astronomical images. But in reality, what the ceiling is about is not about the stars, it is about time. And the thing is that the Egyptians used the stars to measure time. And the fundamental problem in Egypt, and this was the existential issue in Egypt, and is given the circumstances of Egypt, namely, it is an oasis in the middle of a desert. Everything in Egypt revolves around the Nile, and the Nile River is the source of life for Egypt. So one thing that happened, and it stopped happening, but happened at the time of ancient Egypt and up to the 50s, is that every year the river flooded, like in a very periodic way. Once a year, the river had a flooding where the waters in Ethiopia, where the Nile starts, uh, came down, the torrential waters of in Ethiopia, get all this soot and all these soils and minerals that come down in the Nile and basically go into Egypt, and with the flooding, they flood the banks of the Nile, and then the combination of these minerals with the water of the Nile and the sun of the desert creates the most fertile land on earth. And this was an agricultural society, so everything in Egypt depended on the timing, the flooding of the Nile, because all the societal activity of their civilization depended on this and revolved around the cycles of the Nile. So what that makes, right, is that becomes an ideology, and it's the idea that time is not linear like for us. Time is an arrow that goes forever into the future from the past. For them, they had a notion of time that was cyclical.
Yes, everything was cyclical.
Time was perceived as cyclical. So everything is a cycle. So every day the sun rises and sets. To be raised again and reborn the next day. So you have the daily cycle. Every month you have lunations, and month from the word moon, from measurement, means basically the moon grows and shrinks, right? Disappears and then is reconstructed in the sky. So imagine that you could speed up that, and then it's the only celestial body that changes its appearance across time, across the month, right? It grows and dies. And that's why it was associated with the god Osiris, because Osiris dies and resurrects, right? And Osiris was dismembered, and just like the moon is dismembered every month into 14 pieces, right? And is reconstructed again. And that's the myth. When you look at the myth of Osiris and Isis, Osiris is killed by his brother Seth, and is dismembered into all these pieces that are scattered across Egypt, and then his sister, wife, and consort Isis goes around the country with the help of other gods, and they recollect the parts of the body of Osiris, and they reconstruct it. But that's an allegorical view of lunation, which is what happens to this divine being in the sky, that is the moon, that dies and resurrects every month and is dismembered and remembered every month, basically.
Yes, and it's interesting too, as you were talking about the ebb and flow of the Nile. So their seasonal cycle was divided into 3 seasons: the flooding of the Nile, the growing season, the harvesting season. And as you know, they marked the flooding of the Nile by the heliacal rising of the star Sirius, associated with Isis.
That was the beginning of the year, correct?
And they also really saw that ebbing and flow of the Nile as also associated with that life, death, rebirth of Osiris. But some of what you're describing is they understood everything as cycles. And I think, again, they were so deeply connected with the interconnectedness of all of life. And if you live in connection with nature, if you live in connection with the movement of the planets and the stars, then you know everything is interwoven and everything is cyclical. I think it's because we've been in the last 4,000 years in particular in a paradigm of separation. We've disconnected from that understanding of cyclical time and now see things in a more linear way. But I think we're being called back now as we move into the age of Aquarius into reweaving that remembrance that everything is cyclical, everything is interconnected, and everything has meaning, which was also such a core principle for the ancient Egyptians.
Correct. Like when you're talking, it's like my head goes into so many different paths that we could take this conversation, and meaning and interconnectedness. Yes, and because it was existential for them. Because if they were not able to time their activities to and predict correctly the flooding of the Nile, then they starve to death. So it was an existential necessity for them to understand the flooding of the Nile. And what they found, and is this beautiful thing, is that they could use the stars as markers and guides for, because of the regular movement of the stars across the year, they found that they could use this as a guidance to set up and to measure the cycles of time across the Nile. So in a way, and this is one of the insights that I got out of this that is super interesting to me, is the idea that the role of religion is to create a nexus between the divine and the mundane. And in this case, explaining it as a machine, right? In like dismembering this and explaining it in rational terms, what it means is using the celestial beings, the gods, the nethers, the stars, the regulars, right? The things that are harmonious and are order, that is the stars, as guidance and markers to predict and give order and give meaning to the chaos of the everyday. So the problem is that as you become on the day to day, what ends up happening is that because of the complexity of everything that happens around you, you look around it and it looks like chaotic. But it's not that it's chaotic, it is that it's so complex that you cannot read the patterns that move things. But then when you relate this to the movements of the stars, because the stars are simple, right? Like the movement of the stars at the end is not complicated. They're periodical and regular and always reliable. Then their insight and the beauty that they got, and the astronomer priests in Egypt, what they realized, and in antiquity, not only Egypt, is that you could take the movements of the stars and the harmonies, the celestial harmonies, and you could use them to predict what's gonna happen in the future, which is the purpose of astrology. But in this case, in a very concrete and engineering and rational way, and is we have to be able to determine when the Nile is gonna flood, when the flooding of the Nile is gonna happen. So the beauty, what they did is they style, the astronomer priest, they style the movements of the stars into rituals and ceremonies and calendars that dictate the behavior and the modulation of the behavior of beings in the society. So the activities, oh, now it's time to plant, now it's time to harvest, based on looking at, so from the point of view of the peasants that work on the fields, what you have is these guys in white robes that live in these temples, and they're looking at their gods in the skies, and the gods are telling them, and they're predicting what's going to happen in the future, talking to the gods because they have a connection to the gods, because they're in communion with the gods, because they're observing them in the sky.
Yes, yes.
If you look at it from the other side, if I move from the side of the priests, what they're doing, they're scientists. What they're doing is they're measuring the sky, and they're getting the timing of things in the sky, and based on that, they create the calendars of the ceremonies that regiment the activities of society. So religion and the temple is the pacemaker that brings the harmony of the skies into the chaos of the land, of the mundane. And that's the role of religion.
Interesting.
Mhm.
I really think what you're saying is really so reflective of how religion comes into play. And yet part of my interest, as I was telling you before we got on for the interview, is looking
Mhm.
at the larger paradigms that play out in our processional cycle. And you can see that in ancient Egypt, which I find absolutely fascinating. You know, the most ancient sites in ancient Egypt date back to the age of Leo, 12,000 years ago. And then you've got these temples throughout Egypt. Dendera started to be built in the age of Taurus, but as you said, many of the temples built in the age of Aries. When we move into more of that longing for control and that sense of separation of earth and sky, whereas the most ancient temples and sites in Egypt carry this more ancient wisdom of Kemetic spirituality, that there is no separation between earth and sky, and that the deities are here and around us and in us. The metaphysical reality is in this daily reality, and our challenge is how to allow the earth and sky to mirror each other and be in that ongoing balance with each other within us and all around us. So
Right.
it's interesting. I think some of those monitoring of the cycles, and as you move through the different ages, there becomes an increasing split between the caste of the priests and priestesses and the peasants. But in the more ancient times, it was really that sense that we're all part of the oneness. And how do we stay in tune and in harmony with those cycles? The
Correct.
daily cycle, the nightly
And
cycle, the
and
yearly.
if you
Before we lose too much time, let's circle
okay.
back to the temple, because I would love for people to see some of the images. I mean, you spent
Okay.
3 days there taking 5,000 high resolution photographs. It's extraordinary. And then you designed a software program to create this image of the entire ceiling. And your book, Jose, is exquisitely beautiful in terms of the photography and what you've done in helping us piece together the wholeness of that ceiling and its perspective. It's
Thank you so much.
truly beautiful.
Thank you so much. Let me share my screen and I can show you the ceiling. So can you see my screen now?
Beautiful.
Okay. So what you see here is the entirety of the ceiling, and the black things that you hear are the columns. There are the 24 columns, the black squares. So this is this is an impossible view. You can never see the temple like this, right? This is a composition of the whole ceiling. And just to give you an idea, this is probably the size of 2 tennis courts. So it's a very big place. And it's 7 stories high, the ceiling. So it's gigantic. And what you have here is like a God's view of the ceiling, right? Where you can see the whole thing. And just like Google Maps in here, I can start going in, right? And I can start zooming in and looking at the different parts of the ceiling. So let me go back and I'll show you a little bit about the architecture and what is the anatomy of the ceiling. So the ceiling, this is the north is here. So this is looking north here, south here, right? East is here, west is here. And what you have here is there are 7 panels. And usually in Egypt, what happens is that the east was associated with the day and life and birth, and the west was associated with the night and death and the setting of the sun. And it's because of the movement of the cycle of the sun, that the sun every day rises on the east and sets on the west. So it is born on the east and dies on the west to be resurrected again on the east, right? So that's why symbolic, it's like the symbology is west is associated with the night and death and the setting, and the east with the rising. And yeah, so I want to show you this. So when you talk about cycles, and we can talk poetically about cycles and all these things, but cycles are something that is very well studied in mathematics, right? And basically the study of waves, which is the study of cycles, right? And the physics of waves and so on, is the mathematics of cycles. And then what you have is trigonometry, is the study of angles and circles, right? Which in a way is the mathematics that you use to measure cycles. So this is a sinusoidal, right? Like, which is the movement of a vibration. And basically a cycle is defined basically as something that has a starting point, take a starting point, and then you move away from that point where you started, and inevitably at some point you return to that initial point. And that's what you measure in a cycle, and that's what the phases are. So each cycle, so it can be seen as each of these vibrations here, right, has a phase that is going from the origin, away from the origin, until a point that is the point that is the furthest away from the origin, and then you start to come back. So think about, for example, in the case of the sun, the daily cycle of the rise and setting of the sun, right? If I start at sunset, then what happens is that I start to deviate and go away from there until I reach the zenith and the highest point in the sky at noon, right? And the sun is rising, so it's in this rising phase until noon, and then at noon, the sun starts to decline and starts to go down until it dies on the west.
Right.
And you can see this, the same thing with the seasons, right? So if you start, and you can pick a point, right? Like, but if I pick the solstice, say the winter solstice, as the beginning of the cycle, the yearly cycle, what's going to happen is that the sun starts to go up, right, across the year.
Mhm.
And then there's a point where the night and the day have the same length. That are the equinoxes, right? And that's in the northern and southern hemispheres. Because if you're in the equator, in the equatorial line, then what happens is that every day and night have the same length. But because of the angle that the Earth is tilted, then what happens is that across the year, the Earth wobbles, right? Like it goes around the sun, and then what happens is that you have days become longer and shorter and longer and shorter, and that's the cycle of days longer and then shorter and longer and shorter. And as you can see, there is a point in the solstices where you are right at and that's marked here in the chart. The solstices would be here and here, right? This point corresponds to this point, because in reality it's a circle, right? You're coming back to home.
Yes.
So there is all these mathematical aspects and all these features that you can describe on every cycle. And what is interesting about this is that then when you start to look at the Egyptian myths and you look at the myths through the eyes of the mathematics of a cycle, what you find is that the different myths and the different parts of the stories in the myth, what they represent is different phases or different parts of these cycles. So, for example, what happens in the ceiling is that the ceiling, the way it is structured, is that, so another thing that you have in a cycle is how fast it happens, how fast you go away and back, right? And the faster you go, then the shorter it takes to go back to the origin, and that's called the frequency of the cycle. The frequency is how long does it take to complete a whole cycle. So the shortest cycles that you have, right, and then you can then categorize all these vibrations, all these celestial harmonies is in terms of the length of the cycles. So the way the ceiling is structured is that the fastest of all cycles is the center panel, and as you go away through the other panels, then you have lower and lower cycles, right? Now the first one here, and this is what I want to show you,
So Jose, the central channel then is the present moment, isn't that correct?
is the present, which is infinite frequency, right? So at that point in the present, you have infinite frequency, which means it's the fastest possible frequency. And what you have on the sides, which is, you can see here, this is encroach. Let me put it like this so you can see it like here.
Yes, Newt.
So you can see this is the goddess Nut arching around the sky. Basically, she represents the sky, the void of the sky, right? And you can see here, this is the goddess Nut that arches around here. Now, what she is the background in which all the stars run. That is the dark sky, right? But those are the immovable objects in the sky. The most immovable thing that you can have is the darkness of the sky that never changes, that doesn't move, that is associated to death, right? The darkness. And what it is eternity, which is the longest cycle that you can have. That is the infinite period. Like it takes forever to complete a cycle. So I can encompass the wholeness of reality between the present and eternity, because present is infinite frequency, everything vibrating super fast. And then as I start to move away from that, then what ends up happening is that I come to a point that is standing still, that is eternity, that is the darkness of the sky, because that's the lowest possible frequency.
Well, and she's the Milky Way, and she contains our view of the galactic center. So yes, she's really bringing us into that sense of the unity of the universe and this energy of eternity that holds all these smaller cycles of life, death, rebirth. It's beautiful.
Correct. So what these guys managed to do was a map right, encoded in here of the entirety of the universe. This is a diagram of the entirety of existence because it encompasses the wholeness of time from eternity to the present. So, and you cannot escape that, right? Like it's the whole thing. So just to show you, because we could be here for hours showing this, but I want to show you one panel that is incredibly beautiful and sublime, is the panel that represents the daily cycle of the sun, right? Which is from sunset to sort of sunrise to sunset. Uh, so the way they decided to do it was they have all these boats here, and there are 12, representing each of them is one of the hours of the day, the 12 hours of the day, which, by the way, that's an invention of the Egyptians, is to divide time, the daily time, in 12 daily hours and 12 nightly hours. So each hour of the day, and the hour is represented by these deities, these goddesses that are looking backwards to these barges. These boats, what they are, is the boats, because remember, everything is an allegory, and what they used to do is they look at the sky, like the Nile, the divine Nile in the sky. So the sun obviously has to navigate on a boat, and you can see here is the sun as a ram in a boat that is navigating throughout the sky, the blue sky of the right. And so what is beautiful about the depiction is that in the morning, which is basically, if I start here, right, is when the sun rises, like first in the morning at dawn, right, when it first shows up, and then it starts to go up during the day, right, so it goes up, and then at noon it starts to decline and goes down. So the way they decided to represent this, and it's allegorically is beautiful, in the morning the sun is a little child with
Yes.
his thumb in his mouth.
Yes.
And as the goal starts to progress
Sure.
and the hours and the sun starts to rise, then what happens is that the sun starts to grow, right? And it's like in the mid morning, he's a teenager as a ram. So it is a symbol of potency in
Yeah.
the boat, right? But you can see he's a teenager at this point. And as the day goes by, right? Like look how he starts to grow. And then at noon, he's represented as a ram with 4 heads. So this is full potency. And 4 heads, why? Because each of the heads represents one of the 4 cardinal points, right? And this represents the sun as its highest point in the sky during the day, which is at noon. And then from there on, the sun starts to decline. So it starts the passage down into
The waning.
its inevitable death, right? So it starts to grow, and you can see like, so now it becomes a mature guy and so on. And then on the boat, you have the hour looking at the boat. And then at the front of the boat, there is always a figure. So you can see here, we're in the late afternoon. What you have in the front of the boat is a mummy that is basically predicting what's going to happen to the sun, right? It's going to die because when it sets. And then the last boat of the day, what they show is the sun as an old man with a cane, right? Before he sets and goes into the underworld when he dies. So look at how beautifully this depicts is exactly this image of the sun going up and down. This is the synthesis, the mathematical synthesis of what happens to a cycle.
Yes.
In here, shown in an allegorical and a pictorial, beautiful way. And this encompasses 2 things. So this, first of all, shows the cycle of the daily cycle of the sun, but it also shows you the cycle of life. Because when you're born as a baby and as a little kid and you grow up, and then inevitably you start to decline until you die to be reborn the next day. And so it's a beautiful, in a panel, you have a beautiful synthesis of the idea of life that the Egyptians have. And
It's beautiful.
gorgeous.
Okay. Beautiful. And show us in the bigger picture how those panels going um, across the east and then across the west, take us through these different cycles of time. So you have.
Okay, so I can show you a diagram exactly explaining that. That is. Okay, so yes, the structure of the ceiling, right, as we were saying, and let's see if this is, I can show you that in this image. So what you have is the present, as we said, in the center, and you can see the fastest vibration. And
Beautiful.
as you start to go to the east or the west, then the vibration is slower and slower and slower until you reach eternity on the darkness on the extremes of the ceiling, right? And then each of the panels, what you have is here is the panel that we're looking at the sun, the daily cycle of the sun. And then here you have the cycle of the month, that is the moon. And then these two panels, what they show is what they call the decans, in which was basically one of the earliest ways to measure the passage of time uh, devised by the Egyptians. And it's basically what they did is they found these 36 different asterisms, which is an asterism is like a constellation, but with a smaller constellation. So it's a set of stars, right? 36 of them that move on the ecliptic. And what they found is that during the night, they could see when one of these sets of stars used to show up in the horizon, and they used to use that to measure the hours of the night. And what happens is that across the year, that you can use them, they're useful to measure the hours of the night, and they have 36 of them. Hence the decans, because you have 360 degrees, right? So each 10 degrees each of them, and that's what they're called, the decans.
So they divide the constellations or the signs of the zodiac into these segments, three segments.
So they had basically what they had is, so they divide the sky into 36 equal parts, right? 10 degrees each of them. Yes, 10 degrees each of them. And you can use that to measure the hours of the night, because you can measure how often do I have one of them showing up. And basically the priests on the roofs of the temples, they used to measure the setting and the rising of these stars on the sky. And the other thing that they represented, and you can see them in different myths, is all the gates that when you die you have to go through across the night in order to be resurrected the next day, right? So basically what they had is these hours represented that the 36 decans. But the other thing that they are useful for, they were useful for, is you could measure what time of the year you were, because depending on the time of the year, when the sun sets, then a new decan shows up in the horizon depending on the time of the year. So, and these moves revolves around a cycle a year, right? So they were used to measure months as well. So that's these two panels, the panels of the decans, and then the last two panels are the panels of the year, basically, and then the great year, where you have the constellations of the zodiac there and the decans as well.
So it's both the year, the annual cycle, but the great year is also that processional cycle. So it's exquisite, Jose, how
Right.
it goes from the
How,
present to these larger and larger cycles of time.
oh, the way they synthesize everything, right? Like is this syncretic approach to things where what we were talking about before, everything is related to everything else. And because you have this like matrushka, like this doll within a doll within a world where you're looking at everything through a perspective of cycles, then the beauty of that is that the same rules that apply as above, so below. So the same rules that you can apply to little things, then you can apply them to bigger things, and the same raise and decline and all these things that you can measure in cycles and so on, you can apply them at different temporal scales. And then but at the end, all the myths are but one myth, and is the myth of the eternal return,
Yes.
right? The death and resurrection.
And I love that Newt really represents that. And she's either birthing the sun or swallowing the sun in order.
Correct. We can see that. I can show
And I
you that in
love,
this.
Jose, that on the day side of the temple, Newt's eyes are open. On
Yeah,
the night
that's
side of the temple, her eyes.
is gorgeous. So this is the night side, I think, yes. And you can see, look at she's
Yeah,
here, and look at the other end of the temple where
her
the
eyes are
area
open.
is open. And look, what you were saying, what you were referring to, is you see here she's swallowing the sun. The sun, this is the sun, the wing disk is a representation of the sun. And basically when you eat something, when you consume something, this is the sunset, right?
Mhm.
Because you're consuming the horizon, that is this, is consuming, is ingesting the sun.
Yes,
And then in the morning, here you can see she's giving birth to the sun.
yes,
So
beautiful.
you can see her feet, she's arched here. We're looking, we should probably give it like, yeah.
And there you
So
see the image
here are
of
her feet,
the
right?
cow.
She's arching here across the sky. And then at sunrise, she's giving birth to the sun. And this is the goddess Hathor. This is the representation of the temple here. So it's the morning rays of the sun, like showering the temple of Hathor. That's what you have here. And you have here the symbol of Cancer, which
Mm,
is the beginning of the great year. So
mhm.
the scarab was the symbol of Cancer, the Egyptian symbol of Cancer, and it is one of the primordial deities, and it represents the birth of is the moment of creation. And the way they saw it is that the Egyptians saw the scarabs, right, coming out of the earth from these holes, right, like, and then they crawled back there. But is the symbol basically of the birth out
Yeah,
of nothing. Is the birth
creation.
out of nothing, and
Yeah.
that's the so here Nut again. You can see here her legs and is upside down, right, arching on the sky. Is giving birth to the sun in the morning, which is Kefri, is the name of this god. Is the sun in the morning, the god of the primordial creation.
And
Mm,
can you show us, Jose, the
yeah.
image of the eclipse that's also encoded in the ceiling?
Uh, yes, so there is an eclipse. I think it's in the other side of the ceiling. Like there's so many things here that I think this is it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is supposed to be an eclipse, right? So it seems that at the time of the construction of the temple, which like the beginning of the temple was like I think the year 53 BC or something like that,
Do I
uh,
think? Yeah.
there was an eclipse. One Egyptologist who has been studying this temple for a long time, her name is Sylvie Coville. Uh, what she speculates, yeah, as an informed speculation, is that this represents that eclipse that happened at the time, uh, which is interesting, right? Like, so you have this god and the solar disk here, and holding an animal that has destroyed the ear, you don't know, but because of the tail, you see the tail?
Hmm.
It looks like a piglet.
Yes.
And the piglet is one of the animals associated to the god Seth, and which is the god of destruction, right? So
Yes.
so the eclipse and the eclipses were looked as a bad thing, right? In Egypt. For example, one of them is earthquakes. Earthquakes and eclipses are correlated, and you have more earthquakes around times of eclipses because of the gravitational pull of the planets when they're aligned, right? Like you have more pull, and then the crust of Earth gets deformed in a way that is more there is more propensity for earthquakes, for example. Eclipses have been associated with bad times.
And it is that integration of light and dark. You have the
Correct.
sun and
And by
getting,
the way, this is right at the by the side of Aquarius. Or
yes.
yeah, yeah. No, Pisces, sorry, Pisces, Pisces,
Pisces.
Pisces,
Yep.
Pisces, yeah.
Aquarius is the one who,
Here,
yeah,
here
yes.
is
Well,
Aquarius, which
yeah.
is interesting too because this is the god Happy,
Yes.
which is the god of the fertility of the Nile,
Yes.
a god of the flooding of the Nile, and then the god of bounty.
Yes. And the
Mhm.
living waters. Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely. So it's exquisite. I loved, and your book was so helpful in integrating that wholeness of the ceiling. And I loved seeing the six um, uh, signs of the zodiac on one side of the temple and the other six on the other. So Cancer to Aquarius on the day side, and then Capricorn to Leo on the west side.
correct, correct. You can go here if you want. We can travel across them. So you have here Cancer, right? And then a star movie Gemini,
Yes.
right? And then Taurus, Aries,
The ram.
right? Then Pisces, Aquarius,
Mhm.
and I think that's it. Yeah,
And different planetary images interspersed. But yeah, and then show
correct. So you have
other
the
six.
planets there, and yeah, so you have Capricorn,
Mhm.
Sagittarius. Here is Scorpio, Libra. How awesome it is. You see the scales there. And then after Libra, Leo. She's here. And we're done.
Beautiful. Yeah, and before we have to stop, Jose, talk a little bit about the Dendera Zodiac and what happened to that. That's in another part of the temple, but that is such, a profound ancient zodiac that's
So
now.
yeah, that's a fascinating story as well, like everything here. So in on the roof of this temple, Temple of Hathor, they had certain chapels that were associated to the goddess Isis. In one of these chapels, the ceiling of the chapel, what they used to have is what is called the Zodiac of Dendera. That is the circular zodiac, and it's very well known. And years like in the 1820s, a couple of French looters, well, engineers in quotes, went there with gunpowder and saws and then took down the ceiling and transported it to France. And now it's housed at the Louvre Museum. And you can go and see there the original, and they put a plaster copy where they left the hole in the ceiling at Dendera. So you can go today and you can see a plaster copy there. But if you go to the Louvre, you can see the original one. And that's the base of the controversy, and was one of the most controversial and memorable moments in Egyptology and in the 19th century, basically.
Yes, I'm going to pull this out so I can see you. Absolutely. And
Yeah,
um, it's it's sad because you're no longer seeing it in its rightful context. And they almost destroyed the temple in their effort to blast it to take it out. So it's extraordinary. Before we stop, Jose, I would love to
yeah.
hear how your experience of immersing yourself in this in such a deep way, in terms of you're being there, you're taking these photographs, then you're immersing yourself in the analysis of it. How has that impacted you personally?
I don't know yet, or I'm start like it's like going through the middle of a hurricane. It's like all these things happen to you, and definitely it has changed in many ways my view of things, and this holistic idea of trying to have this wholeness on things. And these guys, as you've seen, they were masters at to representing symbols and in beautiful in divine art, very basic principles of who we are and of nature. So I it's very hard to say how like looking at yourself is so hard, and how it has changed me, but definitely it has.
Mm.
We could ask my wife. I think she has a better idea of that than me.
I was just interested in that because my experience of being in those temples is we can integrate a lot of our understanding of them and of the symbols through our conscious
Mhm.
awareness, but they
Right.
also have a very powerful energetic influence.
Oh,
So
easy.
I experience the ways in which they impact us below our conscious
Right.
awareness. And
So it
as you
is,
study, you are really interested in alchemy, and I
yeah.
feel those temples have an alchemical energy, a transformational energy when
Oh,
you're.
they do is, and is this harmon like the beauty is that like an alchemy is a science or an art that was born in Egypt, right? And Egypt itself is the child of the alchemical process, is the which is basically there is something called the coincidence of opposites, and it's the primordial principle of alchemy. It's called the coincidentia oppositorum, and is the synthesis of opposites. And Egypt is that, right? It's the desert and the Nile, water and fire, right? Coming together to create the life of the Nile. So it's the alchemical process is the Nile, is the ancient Egyptian society, pardon, rather. Uh, it is the product of the alchemical process. It's beautiful. And and yeah, I have a more holistic way of looking at things and a big reverence for these ancient people. Like they were like, oh my God, like their wisdom was incredible.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Jose, for the incredible work that you've done and this beautiful book and for taking this time to be in conversation today. So thank you.
Oh, this was an absolute pleasure. And anytime,
Wonderful. And blessings and love to all of you listening.